It's pretty fascinating, isn't it, how events unfolding across the globe,
Mm,
things that seem worlds apart, maybe on the surface,
yeah.
can actually be connected. I mean, think about it. You've got the conflict in the Middle East, political shifts happening in Europe, then a trade deal across the Atlantic, economic rumblings in Asia, even the selection of a new pope.
Hmm.
Are these just isolated stories? We've gathered your sources, and they cover the Israel-Gaza conflict, those India-Pakistan tensions in Kashmir, the AfD in Germany, a recent Trump trade move, China's economy, and the new pope.
Right. Quite a mix.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to dig beneath those headlines, pull out the crucial insights, and try to understand the, well, surprising ways these things might actually link up.
Okay.
We want to give you a clear understanding of what's really important here, without making it feel overwhelming.
And what's striking, I think, when you put all these different situations side by side, is that you start to see certain patterns, underlying pressures kind of emerge. It stops being just a list of news items and starts hinting at some really fundamental shifts happening globally. So maybe let's start by unpacking the situation in Israel and Gaza. The focus seems to be, well, evolving there.
Okay, let's do that. Unpack it. It looks like the conversation's shifting maybe beyond just targeting Hamas militarily to a broader idea of occupying Gaza.
That seems to be part of the discussion now, yes.
And this shift is causing ripples, isn't it? Like, we
Yeah.
saw that letter from Casper Veldkamp in the Netherlands suggesting maybe pausing the EU-Israel Association Agreement talks.
That's right, and your sources really highlight a significant split, a divergence in how different groups within Dutch society are seeing this conflict.
How so?
Well, you have sort of links progressive academics, the Muslim community. They often frame it through what's called an anti-colonial narrative.
Okay.
And interestingly, one source suggests this perspective might, for some people anyway, overshadow the importance of Holocaust remembrance, which, raises a really important point about how different historical lenses shape how we see things now.
Definitely.
Meanwhile, Israel's actions are being described as moving towards more integral war. They mean tighter controls on aid, food, maybe even possibly annexing parts of Gaza.
Which you can imagine is generating strong reactions internationally. Your sources mention some in the international community are looking at these actions and using terms like potentially genocide or ethnic cleansing.
Yes,
And that, well, obviously makes international cooperation and getting aid incredibly difficult.
absolutely. And if you connect this to the bigger picture, it's kind of notable how relatively, well, muted the response has been from some other Muslim-majority countries and the wider Arab world. Your source material hints at a certain level of frustration there, maybe a feeling of being abandoned. Plus, there's this idea that the fight against Hamas isn't just military, it's also against a deeply ingrained idea, fueled by these narratives of victimhood.
That really shows how complex it is, how long-term.
It is. We're talking deeply held beliefs, different histories colliding. And the human tragedy, well, that's undeniable. Symbolized so powerfully by that story of the two fathers, one Palestinian, one Israeli. Both lost their sons.
Yeah, heartbreaking. This brings in that concept your sources mentioned, interregnum, like an in-between phase for the global order.
Exactly. Where the authority of established international institutions is being, well, challenged.
Like the International Criminal Court investigating Israel over humanitarian aid. That feels like a prime example of that tension.
It does. It's like the old social contract, the understanding between supranational bodies, national governments, local communities. It's under strain. You see echoes of it with Russia and Ukraine, too.
Yeah, you do. The old rules seem less certain.
Precisely. The connections are quite stark, actually. Now, if we shift our focus over to Kashmir, geographically distant, obviously, but sharing some, frankly, unsettling parallels with Gaza, as your sources point out.
Absolutely. Another region shaped by that post-colonial division, right?
Yeah.
Deeply tangled up with religious and ethnic tensions. This disputed territory part's controlled by China, Pakistan, India, and then there was that recent terrorist attack April 22nd, targeting non-Muslims specifically in the Indian-ministered bit.
And what's interesting to note there alongside this violence is that India has been sort of steadily tightening its grip on its part of Kashmir since 2019. Remember, they revoked its semi-autonomous status.
Right, I remember that.
So you have this consolidation of power happening against the backdrop of these heightened tensions after the attack. India's taking a firm stance. Pakistan's calling for an investigation. It just underlines how delicate, how potentially explosive this is.
And there's even talk of revoking that 1960 water treaty.
That's mentioned as a possibility, yeah. Which would have huge implications for the whole region.
The fact that you've got two nuclear powers tangled up in a conflict that mirrors so many of these post-colonial religious, ethnic struggles, that's particularly worrying, isn't it?
It really is.
Makes you think about borders themselves. Are they just lines drawn after wars constantly up for grabs?
Well, your sources touch on a really fundamental philosophical point there. That tension between state sovereignty, the nation's authority, and popular sovereignty, the right of the people within those borders to decide for themselves.
Like Catalonia or the Basque region.
Exactly. Those examples illustrate it well. That desire for self-rule bumping up against the existing state. And you can definitely see echoes in Ukraine, countless other border disputes historically. And it seems, too, that religion is playing an increasingly prominent and often divisive role.
Okay, right. Let's shift gears then over to Europe. Germany, the process of getting the new chancellor installed seemed quite drawn out. Sounds like the political atmosphere is pretty charged.
Indeed. A key thing there is the Brandmauer, which you can think of as a political firewall or cordon sanitaire against the AfD,
Yeah.
the Alternative for Germany party.
Right.
But things have really heated up because the German intelligence agency, the Verfassungsschutz, has now classified the AfD as a suspected right-wing extremist organization.
And the timing on that was notable, wasn't it? Your sources point out this huge, like, 1,100-page report, and the press conference announcing it happened right before the new government officially started.
Pretty pointed timing, yeah.
Yeah.
And unsurprisingly, the AfD is challenging that classification legally.
So what are the main reasons they gave for the classification?
Your sources mention connections between people within the party and, critically, this concept of Völkisches Denken, which is tricky to translate perfectly, but it's like ethnic nationalist thinking.
Okay.
It includes ideas about who counts as a real German and talk about remigration, the idea that people with migrant backgrounds should leave Germany.
Wow. Okay, so if we think about the wider impact, labeling a party that's pulling around, what, 20%, calling them extremist, raises some big questions, right, about the health of political debate.
It definitely does. There's a concern it could stifle debate on really important, sensitive topics like immigration, German identity. Your source even mentions this term, Messer Jihad, knife attacks,
Yeah.
and the complex factors behind those incidents. Migration background, mental health, potential religious elements. It just shows how tangled these issues get in the political climate.
And there's an argument, isn't there, that just slapping an administrative label on the AfD might actually backfire.
That's certainly perspective in your sources, yeah.
Yeah.
That it might galvanize right-wing feeling rather than actually
Yeah.
addressing the underlying political issues or anxieties people have. It's a really delicate balancing act.
It feels like we've seen similar things elsewhere in Europe, using legal tools against political figures.
Yeah.
Romania, France, the Netherlands even.
It does seem to be part of a broader trend, yes. Trying to use legal or administrative means to constrain certain political movements. What's also interesting is the discussion around what citizenship means now. Is it just a passport? Or is there less of a shared sort of cultural or civilizational understanding? Common references like museums, history.
That contrast with how groups like the Huguenots integrated historically really stands out.
It does. It seems there may be different challenges today with language, culture, economic contribution for some communities. And, of course, your sources don't ignore the AfD's language and symbols.
Which echo Nazi Germany.
Precisely. Yeah. Which, for very obvious historical reasons, causes huge alarm in Germany. The weight of that past, the ongoing struggle to define German identity today, it adds such a profound layer of complexity.
Definitely. Okay, let's hop continents again. Trump. And this recent trade deal with the UK, his first since putting on all those import tariffs, right?
That's the one.
And the initial reaction seems a bit skeptical. Your sources suggest it might be more pop and cast-like, a puppet show, a
About
performance.
the theater, yeah, rather
So-
than some massive policy shift,
Yeah.
especially since the U.S.-UK trade is already fairly balanced.
Right. What's interesting is Trump apparently needing to kind of hype up the deal, even talking to Keir Starmer, the UK Labour leader, about it.
The specifics seem to be around the steel industry, because the UK isn't producing as much and maybe new chances for U.S. grain and meat exports. There's also a little mention of the UK maybe missing out on mineral deals in Ukraine, which adds another geopolitical angle.
It looks like the UK is going for that direct bilateral trade approach,
Yeah.
different from the EU's way, which can be more bureaucratic, sometimes more critical.
True. And Keir Starmer seems to be putting a positive spin on this deal, despite Labour having some recent election losses.
So if we think about Trump's art of the deal playbook,
You see elements, right? aiming for something that looks like a big win, trying to find leverage, though maybe less obvious here, and definitely the poiha, the whole fanfare around making the deal happen.
Yeah, the performance aspect again.
But the big question is, does this mean he's going to start cutting tariffs more broadly? Or is it just transactional, deal-by-deal stuff?
We don't know yet.
Exactly. Your sources even touch on a potential link between, say, the U.S. military umbrella, like in the Suez Canal, and this sort of emerging, more mercantilist economic order.
Which brings us to a really important distinction your sources make. The difference between these one-off deals and, well, actual long-term political strategies, governance.
Yes, that's crucial.
There seems to be quite a bit of doubt expressed about whether you can solve really complex global problems, like Ukraine, just with a deal-making approach.
Absolutely. And you see how important image-making is in politics today. Trump's constantly shifting positions, his pronouncements. Could that actually be undermining his authority internationally?
Possibly. Meanwhile, the U.S. seems to be getting deeper into the Ukraine war without maybe a super clear long-term plan.
That's a concern raised, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, if you contrast Trump's, let's say, erratic style with China, you get a completely different picture. Highly bureaucratic, politically very closed system.
Right.
And your sources detail quite a few emerging economic headaches in China. We've all heard about the real estate bubble Evergrande, those ghost cities, buildings being demolished.
Yeah, the images are stark.
Plus rising household debt. A huge surplus of university graduates who can't find jobs, leading to climbing youth unemployment.
The potential for social unrest there, with all those pressures building, that must be a worry.
It's certainly mentioned as a potential consequence, and your sources frame this whole global moment as maybe having a rhyme with 1989, a time when the existing order is being seriously tested again.
How so?
Well, the suggestion is Russia might be weathering the storm better than many expected initially. The West is dealing with its own internal divisions and challenges, and China seems to be entering this phase of real economic uncertainty.
It really underlines the need, as your sources say, to look beyond just European or Western news sources, doesn't it?
Definitely. Maybe look at news from India, other places, to get a fuller picture of these shifts. Think about Zelensky's drone attack timed for Russia's Victory Day, while all those international leaders were in Moscow.
Yeah, that was pointed.
It raises a provocative thought. Could Europe be maybe inadvertently isolating itself a bit in its viewpoints and alliances?
With the rise of BRICS, populism internally, it's a valid question. Okay, now let's turn to something completely different. The Vatican. A new pope, Robert Prevost. An American cardinal, active in Peru, taking the name Leo XIV.
That's him. Described as an Augustinian, focused on synodality, which basically means a more collaborative, listening approach in the church and on building connections.
And he's English-speaking, strong ties to the global south through South America.
Right. What's interesting there are the potential geopolitical dimensions. Your sources note the historically somewhat limited ties between the Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox tradition, plus the really complex situation for Catholics in China, the official church versus the underground one.
So what are the implications?
Well, there's a suggestion this new pope could maybe act as a kind of counterweight to certain nationalist or isolationist thinking, perhaps including what gets called Magyar thought in the U.S. He might bring a different tone to talks about migration, for example. His background could position him to play a more nuanced role globally, maybe influencing U.S. politics, possibly even the Russia-Ukraine situation, perhaps offering a subtle course correction for figures like Trump.
It's definitely something to watch, given the church's global reach, far-reaching consequences, potentially. Okay, finally, just quickly, there was that local Dutch news item in your sources, the fuss about the NOS executive's salary.
As the public broadcaster. News of a very high salary, $325,000 a year for an executive there, understandably caused quite a public reaction.
Yeah, it's being framed as, self-enrichment, maybe a symptom of wider issues in public institutions there.
And the timing, the optics.
Yeah.
Especially if the broadcaster is facing potential budget cuts. It just looks tone deaf, doesn't it?
It does. Raises fair questions about value. What are these top managers providing compared to the journalists actually doing the work?
It highlights that potential disconnect, between leadership pay and what's happening on the ground. So as we wrap this up, it's really remarkable how these stories, which seem so separate at first glance,
They really do weave together, don't they?
they contribute to this larger interconnected picture.
Absolutely. We've touched on the sort of fragility of the international order, the rise of populism, nationalism in different places, big economic uncertainties, shifts in global power. These themes just kept popping up.
And understanding those connections gives you a much richer, more nuanced view of the world than just reading isolated headlines.
For sure.
And it leaves us with a question for you, the listener, to think about. How will all these interconnected crises, these shifts, ultimately reshape the global landscape in the next few years? What are the deeper forces driving these changes, maybe beyond the daily news cycle?
Yeah, something to really mull over. Think beyond the surface noise. And hey, if you want to dive deeper into discussions like this, we'll actually be at the New World Festival on July 4th.
That's right.
You can find a link for tickets and more info in the show notes.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, please do give us a thumbs up on YouTube. It genuinely helps other people find the content. And for anyone who wants to support us more directly, our Patreon link is also right there in the description.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive today. We look forward to exploring more connections with you next time.